Our moderator, Teresa Ghilarducci, is a New School professor of economic policy analysis, and she's also the director of the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis. She is the nation's leading authority on the economics of retirement. She has a recent book called When I'm 64, The Plot Against Pensions and the Plan to Save Them. I almost broke into song. That's just been released. Congratulations, Teresa, on that book. Laura Tyson is a professor of economics at the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley. She was formerly in the position of what has become known as the chief economist of the United States, as chair of the Council on Foreign Advisors under President Clinton. We all were quite pleased, Laura, to see your and my candidate's high opinion of economists after she was asked by George Stephanopoulos to defend her gas tax cut. We are nonetheless pleased that you will talk to us about the economic recovery plan that Congress and the President fashioned when the economy started to slow earlier this year. Heidi Crebo-Rediker is the co-director of the New America Foundation's Global Strategic Finance Initiative. Prior to that, she spent close to 2 decades in Europe as a senior investment banker for several leading global investment banks, including Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and Merrill Lynch. Tom Gallagher is a senior managing director and head of the policy research for International Strategy Investment Group. Prior to that, he worked for 20 years on Wall Street at ISI and Lehman Brothers, and spent 8 glorious and wonderful years with the federal government, mainly on Capitol Hill, precisely for former Majority Leader George Mitchell. Larry Mishel is the president of the Economic Policy Institute. He has researched, he has written, he has spoken widely on the economy and economic policy as it affects, in particular, middle and low-income families. And I welcome all of the panelists and ask the audience here today to give them a welcoming round of applause. When we started this series, there was a considerable amount of talk about whether or not the U.S. economy was going to end up in a recession. In a fairly short time, we've moved to if, to when, to how long. It is a binary debate that, to my mind at least, doesn't really add an awful lot of light to a discussion, but that's the world we live in. So I presume that we'll have some discussion of whether we are or are not, and if we are, how long. But also, more importantly, to explore the realities behind various economic stimulus strategies that have been proposed. Each of our 4 speakers and our moderator will discuss the economics behind the stimulus package and the potential for government investment in infrastructure. We hope to look at the political reality in line with the economic logic that will explore the pros and the cons of marrying the 2 goals of any economic policy, long-term efficiency and productivity, with a short-term recovery plan, and I would add, from my point of view, some kind of measurement of economic justice and equality. It's my pleasure to turn the podium at this point over to Teresa Ghilarducci. I will go get myself a cup of coffee and sit with Bernard Schwartz and listen to the panel.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. The panel today will consist mainly of Laura giving her views about economic policy and especially our times now, and then we'll move on to our panelists. We'll have a short discussion, but we really are very interested in hearing your views and your questions. So I'll be sure to preserve and privilege that time for you all. Without the economy being officially declared in a recession, it is remarkable that Congress moved so quickly. In the spring, they allocated this money for economic stimulus checks that are going into people's bank accounts and their mailboxes. As we sit here today, though, that money is arriving. And the recovery plan, the economics of it, it aims to give households, the target is households, more spending power. And it really represents a kind of a basic off-the-shelf recovery plan. The fear is that this recovery plan, because it's off the shelf and does target just consumers, may be very, very wrong in a very basic way. It's supposed to work this way. The government gives money to households, and they are to go to the store. This is according to the theory, which is supposed to cheer producers, who then employ more people, who earn the wages and buy the houses that Jack built. That's the chain of events. However, this time, the consumer, even though we had a big expansion, is busted. Never before in good times have households deaccumulated so many assets. We fear that when the consumer gets that check, that she will either pay down her debt or she'll buy the stuff that was built in China. So that few jobs are created here, few wages are forthcoming, and no one buys the houses that Jack built. Old-fashioned Keynesianism, or the Keynesianism that has been created today, may not work this time because the sources of our economic problems are quite different, and therefore our solutions should be more inspired. And that's why we're here today. It is my pleasure to turn over the podium to Laura Tyson, and after which the panelists will give their remarks, and then we'll open it up to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. I should mention I'm very proud of the fact that Teresa is a PhD student and successful professor coming out of the University of California at Berkeley, where I knew her as a student. So I'm very pleased to be with her today. I will just start with a very quick economic overview. I don't actually disagree much with what Teresa said. I'll try to put the reasons why we took an off-the-shelf stimulus package approach. I'll try to explain the reasons for that and some of the pluses of that and some of the negatives. But first, let me just say something general about the overall economic situation. And I want to try to stick to my time, so you have a great panel here, and I actually want to hear from them. I don't think we need to debate whether the economy is in recession. We don't know. Technically, it's got a certain definition. We don't know till after the fact. What we do know is that the economy is in a very significant slowdown period, and that there are very serious pressures acting to put a damper on current and future economic growth. Sometimes I refer to this as the economy is in a recessionary downdraft, because who knows if we're in a recession or not. To understand some of the pressures, we have to understand what the basis of the expansion was between 2000 and 2006. That expansion was basically consumption spending and housing. That was more than half of the spending power of the U.S. economy. This was a particularly consumption and housing-driven period of demand. And now that situation has become entirely undone. We are now in a situation, the first time since the Great Depression, where median housing values have fallen around in the country. They've already fallen by 10%. Most people feel that by the time it's over, maybe they've fallen by 20%, leaving Americans with about $4 trillion less in wealth, leaving Americans 15% or so with underwater equity positions in their home. We just haven't dealt with this since the Great Depression. Most of us in this room everyone in this room would have no sort of recollection of that. Foreclosures are at unprecedented levels. The inventory of unsold housing is at unprecedented levels. Now, this comes out of a period that consumption and housing was driven by long hours at work and a lot of two-earner income families. Okay, so in a sense, as my colleague Bob Reich has pointed out, the American middle class has tried a variety of ways to maintain their living standards. More people work, they work more hours. Now we have a situation in which we're getting rising layoffs, shorter working hours, and stagnating wages. Another thing about this just over expansion, it's the first period of expansion where median family incomes in real terms have actually fallen. So most you go through a recessionary period, you come out, you grow for some number of years. During those number of years, you recover and go beyond the last peak in median family income. This time, no. This time, median family incomes in real terms have gone down by estimates I've seen about $1,000. Now, that doesn't sound like much, maybe, but think about it from the point of view of the median family who is paying much more in education, much more for gasoline, much more for health. Elizabeth Warren at Harvard Law School has done a calculation that if you look at the necessities households need to spend on, necessities like gasoline, like housing, like education, those have gone up by more than $6,000 during this time period. So American middle-class median families in the hole by $5,000. The reason I bring this up is because lots of economists are prone to say, gee, America is suffering from overconsumption. American households are consuming too much. They have to save more. It sort of sounds like we're a bunch of spendthrifts and people aren't saving for their future. Well, once you put into the picture the necessities people are spending on, and their income, you can see why they're not saving very much. So the problem actually is more on the income side than on the saving side. So we have a serious situation. The housing crisis, of course, as you know, particularly sitting in New York, has triggered a major financial shock. And again, most people would say this is the greatest financial shock since the Great Depression. I certainly hear that all the time from my friends on Wall Street. What that means for the American economy is that the American financial institutions are in a situation where they want to contract. They want to make lending standards much tougher. They want to rebuild their capital. So we now have a slowing economy, a hard-pressed consumer, and a financial services industry which wants to pull back on credit. So a credit contraction on top of the slowdown coming from consumer spending. The estimates of that credit contraction magnitude are there's a pretty broad range, but let's say it takes somewhere between around 2 percentage points off of growth through next year. We're not talking about just right now. We're talking about through next year. So you can put some extra stimulus in the economy, but you're putting this in, and the financial markets are essentially pulling back. Now, what do you do about this from a policymaker's point of view? First of all, I will say that I think the Fed has been both proactive and reactive, and it's done sensible things. And we can talk about this in the Q&A. But I think the Fed has been really going quite far and willing to push the envelope to stave off a major financial crisis. They've also put into place 325 basis points of interest rate reduction, which over time, gradually, and particularly in the second half of this year and going into next year, should have some effect on credit market conditions. So they're trying to offset the financial institutions' desire to contract. So I think that we can talk about monetary policy, but I think they acted quickly. I think they acted significantly. And in the case of Bear Stearns, I think they acted innovatively to stave off a crisis. And I think that will help add demand going forward in the economy. In the meantime, the fiscal authorities, that the Congress and the administration did come together in rather remarkable time to provide a stimulus package. Now, I will say some of the positive things about the stimulus package. It was timely. I mean, there's this notion that a good stimulus has to satisfy 3 T's. It has to be timely, it has to be temporary, it has to be targeted. Okay, timely means when the economy is most weak, when demand is most contracted, you want to put some additional spending power in. Okay, maybe those households won't spend $1 out of every dollar. Maybe they'll spend 50 cents out of every dollar, but that's still something, particularly given the high energy prices and other things, food prices, that the consumer is suffering from. So the timeliness, no one can doubt. The temporary nature of this, well, this basically goes into effect between now and the end of the year, and then it's over. Now, that means it's stimulating the economy for essentially 2 quarters. What happens next year, given everything I just said about the substantial headwinds in the economy, would depend back on what happens to monetary policy unless we have a second stimulus. But it was temporary, so it turns off. The idea of temporariness is that if you don't know how long a slowdown in demand is going to last, so you don't want to speed it up forever. You want to speed it up temporarily and then check to see how it's going. And finally, targeted, the idea here is it should go to those who need it most and where it is most likely to be spent. Now, there I think one could debate whether this package, most economists would have said a stimulus package should have more unemployment compensation, more food stamps, less tax relief throughout the tax system, because we don't really, the target should be those who are most affected by the slowdown. But anyway, temporary, timely, and targeted. I want to bring your attention to something else that's happened this week, because during the time the stimulus was being discussed, and I know this from talking to Speaker Pelosi and others in the Democratic leadership, is they felt that getting bipartisan support on a stimulus was an important first step to doing some other significant things that would be much harder to achieve politically. This week we now have evidence, indication, that the housing bill that started with Barney Frank's efforts in the House, where there were essentially no Republicans coming along, has now been joined by a Senate bill from Senator Dodd, where we now have an indication that the Senate is likely to bring enough Republicans along to pass this legislation. In the background, not very loud, but in a series of speeches, Ben Bernanke has been supporting the idea of a massive housing bill to really try to deal with foreclosures. Because one of the problems we have in the situation right now is a sort of spiral effect. We have housing prices falling anyway because we had a bubble and the bubble has been pierced. But then you have an unprecedented number of foreclosures. Foreclosures bring down housing values themselves. They bring down communities themselves. And that leads to further housing price decline. So there's the spiral. And if you can restructure some of these outstanding mortgages into longer-term mortgages that can be financed, you can stop these unnecessary foreclosures. And we've done that before. We did it in the Great Depression. Remember, we're dealing with the first housing price decline since the Great Depression in median terms. We're dealing with the greatest financial shock since the Great Depression. We should look at policies which were helpful in the Great Depression at stabilizing some of our financial markets. So I just want to say, read that legislation, applaud it. It has some problems, but really it is an essential part. You can't do just monetary policy. You can't do just fiscal policy in this situation. You have to do a series of things that go directly to the root of the problem, and that is in housing. Now, there is discussion in the Congress about the possibility for a second stimulus package, and that I think we can talk a lot about today, what we think should be in that. Right now, I think the view is let us see what happens in the second half of the year with the housing legislation, with the current stimulus package, with the monetary policy effects lagging into the economy. Let's see what happens with the elections. But people are beginning to put together the elements of a second stimulus package. Now, I would say, from the point of view of timely, targeted, and temporary, if those are the three principles you're looking at in stimulus creation, then to go back to what policies might be included, I would say an extension of unemployment benefits, because in a prolonged slowdown, you're going to have more people unemployed for longer periods of time. Our unemployment compensation already is so weak, and Larry can speak to this, but we only cover about a third at most of workers who are unemployed. We could do much more. So unemployment compensation, food stamps, well, in a general food price situation, food stamps are a good idea in a recession. In this food price situation, food stamps are an essential aspect of stimulus response. Aid to states and local governments. States, of course, most states have balanced budget requirements. They are cutting back like mad on everything, on education, on health, on infrastructure maintenance, on everything. In California, one of the nearby cities has now declared bankruptcy. We need to think about aid to state and local governments, and particularly maybe linked to Medicaid, which might be the simplest way to do this, since states have a huge part of the Medicaid bill that they must pay. Now, what about infrastructure? Since this is the topic this morning, and I think my role might be a little bit to talk about the conventional wisdom, and then to let my panelists talk about the unconventional wisdom. So I'll give you the conventional wisdom. First of all, the theory of economic stimulus, the whole theory, the Keynesian theory, is that sometimes demand in the economy falters, and we have to figure out policies to enhance demand. Now, that is not talking about the ability of the economy to be productive or to grow. It's not talking about the supply capacity of the economy. It's saying what we want to do, because the problem is temporary, is stimulate demand. Now, you might say, okay, but one way the government could stimulate demand would be by spending money on infrastructure, by hiring people to work on roads and bridges, by hiring people to retrofit existing government buildings so they are energy efficient, by hiring people to work on strengthening helping to rebuild the levees in New Orleans. Why not try to combine these very significant infrastructure needs of our country with the desire to generate additional demand? Okay, that's the question. And I ask myself that question a lot. So I'll give you the conventional wisdom answers for why it's really hard to do. And I would say there are economic answers and there are political answers. So the economic answers are, remember timeliness? Got to get the money out there being spent really fast in a matter of months. How do you do that with infrastructure spending? Now, some people say, well, let's have a long list of projects standing in the background there, and if the economy goes into recession, we trigger them off the list, and they go to be spent on. Well, the problem with that is they're really good projects. We should be spending on them anyway, rather than leaving them on the list. That's not a very attractive thing to do. You want to spend on them. Secondly, even with that, it usually takes rather long lead time to get these projects started. Even on the shelf, they can't be mobilized that quickly. And then the spend out on most infrastructure projects is actually pretty slow. So in a whole project, you might only spend a quarter or a third of the total in a year. Yeah, but in a stimulus situation, we want every cent spent as quickly as possible. So that's the problem with timeliness. The problem with temporariness is, by nature, infrastructure spending is not temporary. It's usually requires several years. That's what you want it to. It's a long-term investment in our long-term future. We don't want to turn it on and off. Okay, start building the bridge next week. Okay, turn it off now because basically we stimulated the economy enough. You can't do that. And so the temporary problem, it doesn't meet the temporary test. It doesn't meet the timely test. It doesn't meet the temporary test. So those are the two arguments against using it as a stimulus. The political arguments are really quite interesting. First of all, I will say the problem of mixing the message. I really learned this in 1993. In 1993, we economists, we were so clever. We said, okay, and Bobby will remember this, we're going to have a two-part budget program. The first part is going to be temporary stimulus because the economy really is weak. But, by the way, we're going to have a 5-year deficit reduction plan. We're going to temporarily stimulate the economy, 5-year deficit reduction plan. This was politically impossible. Basically, people said, okay, you're increasing the deficit and then you're going to decrease the deficit, right? You're going to build some swimming pools and libraries and things like that. A lot of silly stuff got in the stimulus package. And then you're going to sort of deficit reduce. That doesn't make any sense. What are you really for? So the politics of messaging is really important here in terms of getting the Congress to go along. The swimming pools and libraries situation is that if you declare that you're going to do a stimulus and you're going to have government spending be part of the stimulus, then it is true, and maybe Senator Kerrey can talk about this, that people will try to put their favorite projects in this. Hey, it's a stimulus. We could actually, there's some money allocated for things we never thought we really could finance, but now we can. So you have a real political problem of getting the most sensible projects. See, the most sensible projects should be going on anyway. They shouldn't be on some list or in somebody's back pocket waiting for an opportunity to spend on. So you get packages that are not necessarily very defensible in terms of components. And that sort of gets to the issue of how do you define what is capital? Because in an infrastructure spend, you want to make sure that the projects really meet standards of what is a sensible long-term investment. In the immediacy of the moment of crafting stimulus, remember I'm talking about political problems here, in the immediacy of the moment of crafting stimulus, it is very hard to have that careful assessment of projects and evaluations, which I think the pamphlet or the study on infrastructure spending and the panelists would agree we need. We need a mechanism to increase infrastructure spending, but we need a mechanism which makes sure that when we do that, we have defined capital carefully, assessed rates of return carefully, and funded those projects we really believe in. So I would say that instead of focusing on getting infrastructure into stimulus, which I think is unlikely to be effective, we need to focus on mechanisms to increase the share of infrastructure spending in overall federal spending. And we need to do that by seriously considering alternative ways of handling infrastructure spending. There are some very interesting ideas out there. There's the idea of the National Infrastructure Bank from Hagel and Dodd. There's the idea of a capital budget. Rosa DeLauro has some very forward-looking ideas in terms of creating a new federal government agency that would be independent and would help put together financing packages for infrastructure. We need to seriously move on that kind of institutional change in government so that we can get more serious about infrastructure spending. The numbers, I don't have to tell anyone in this audience, they're compelling, the need for the U.S. to spend much, much more on its declining infrastructure. Now, I want to end with a couple of notes about going forward into the next, whoever is the next president. I think that this focus on infrastructure should be an important priority. Leaders only have a limited amount of time to really move the policy agenda forward. They have to be clear on what their priorities are. I think finding a mechanism for increasing infrastructure spending in the United States should be one of the priorities of the next administration. I absolutely think that is the case. I think it can be tied to our concerns about energy and our concerns about global warming. I think if we look at study after study, a very compelling one to read and a simple one is McKinsey, you can see that we may be able to address about half of our carbon emissions problems if we simply had a serious energy efficiency campaign in the United States. Now, that campaign does require things like congestion charging on prices. It does require things like serious retrofitting of existing buildings. These are major infrastructure-related issues. But we can tie the need to cut our energy dependence, the need to cut our carbon emissions to an infrastructure agenda. And I think the next president should do that. And finally, although it's not on the agenda here, I do want to say that in terms of the priorities of the next administration, I would add infrastructure, energy, and over here I would add health care. And the reason I want to mention that is because I think health care reform addresses so many issues together for the U.S. economy. First of all, it is more than 15% of the U.S. economy at this point, and nobody thinks we have it right. So we have a large and growing part of the economy which is not behaving according to the efficiency standards we believe in America we can achieve. That by itself should be a reason for doing health care reform. Secondly, the government budget. Over the next 10 years, the deficit outlook does not look that bleak. And indeed, if we allow some of the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts to expire, it's really quite okay for the next 10 years. And then it just all falls apart. And it all falls apart not because of Social Security, but because of health care. And health care all falls apart not because Medicare is inefficient, but because the health care system is inefficient. So in order to deal with the long-term budget problem, you've got to deal with health care. U.S. competitiveness. Well, we certainly know that the drag on U.S. producers from carrying that burden of health care, particularly for retirees, has been very significant. The U.S. support in the population for globalization is totally dissipated. Basically, the U.S. has now turned into an anti-globalization economy. What can we do to change that attitude? I think the single most effective thing we can do is eliminate the insecurity workers feel when they lose a job because they lose health care. That's the single most pro-globalization thing the U.S. could do is health care reform. And finally, that hard-pressed middle class who can't save anything. A major reason they can't save anything is because their income is not going up nearly at the rate of their health care premiums and insurance. So I leave you with those thoughts. There's a brilliant panel here, and we can learn a lot about how to make this infrastructure goal a reality. Thank you.
Heidi, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. Although the title of the panel is broadly defined economy, I'm going to focus on the subject of infrastructure specifically and how we can look to pay for improving it. I know most of us here would agree that America's basic infrastructure is inadequate to handle the demands of a 21st century economy. And when I look around the world, and see how other nations have approached the topic of infrastructure, I can only conclude that in order for us to remain competitive in this 21st economy, both political leaders and the public must recognize the need to invest in capital assets like roads and rail, bridges, mass transit. It's a matter of competitiveness. It's also a matter of public safety. But in addition to the benefits to those who use infrastructure, there's another potential benefit, and that's the increased infrastructure spending may well serve as a key driver of growth for our economy in the future. And this is an argument that's being put forward by a colleague of mine at the New America Foundation, Schwartz, who is about to publish a piece on it in the coming months, which I highly recommend. First, let me say I am not an economist. My perspective on economic matters is as a market participant and a banker. And at the New America Foundation, I focus primarily on large global capital flows and their strategic impact on the U.S. So you might be wondering why I'm here today to talk about infrastructure. Well, in analyzing those large pools of capital, literally trillions of dollars that are held by central banks and sovereign wealth funds and pension funds worldwide, we decided to focus not just on the threat that those funds could pose to the U.S., but also the opportunities that they do present. And we thought about what needs this country has that could reach into the trillions. And as a result, it got us thinking a lot about infrastructure investment. And in putting the pieces of the puzzle together to find out why these large pools of capital flow readily into European infrastructure investment, but not the U.S., what are the bottlenecks, and what kind of market mechanisms could we come up with to attract these pools into U.S. infrastructure investment? Because as obvious as the need is to invest in infrastructure are the limits of just how much funding is available from government, from the federal, state, and local level. So the growing scale of the need compels us to look beyond government to close the infrastructure financing gap that we have today. So even with inflation, the trillions that are needed, trillion is a very, very big number. It's a lot of money, even by Washington standards. And the good news is that there is an abundance of private capital that is available to invest in infrastructure across all levels of the capital structure, from debt to equity. That's about $400 billion of private equity funds that are available, specifically looking for investment in infrastructure projects. And the amount of funds that are in the large pools of capital that I referred to earlier are approaching 30 trillion and growing fast. So this is where, if we're going to channel in these funds, we want to look at doing it in a way that can truly benefit the U.S. So on the one hand, we have enormous infrastructure financing needs, and on the other, we have these enormous pools of capital that are available. And the trick, we figured, was to bring the two together in a way that would be sustainable and commercially and politically viable. Most infrastructure costs in this country over the recent past have been paid by a combination of government tax dollars and through the municipal bond markets. But in looking at the municipal bond markets today, they're simply inadequate to provide finance on the scale of investment that's needed. And because of the relatively small sizes of the individual municipal bonds and the tax benefit that they give to individuals, it is not where the world's pools of capital are actually interested in investing in. The average secondary trade size of a municipal bond is $25,000 because it's basically driven by individuals. And most of the central banks that I know would look at $25 million as an average trade size. So the difference is really pretty big if you're talking about what kind of instruments you need to look at to attract these global pools of funds. Because it's hard to get a trillionaire interested in a bond issue of less than $1 billion or so. So we decided to focus on a couple of ideas to see if we could get these global pools of capital interested in infrastructure investment in the United States, just as they are already doing in other parts of the world. And just by way of background, I just came back from almost 2 decades in Europe as working as a banker there, mobilizing these pools of capital and directing it towards European infrastructure investment. I'm not saying that the private sector take over the functions of government in all cases of infrastructure spending, but we do believe that there needs to be a recognition in the U.S., just as there have been in other parts of the world, that there's a real role for both the public-private partnership and also financial markets to help finance infrastructure. But those public-private partnerships have to be financed. So here are two ideas that we came up with to help draw those pools of capital into our equally enormous infrastructure needs. First, we're proposing the creation of a U.S. public sector covered bond market. And bear with me for a second on the technicality. A covered bond is a debt security. It's a bond that's backed by cash flows from public sector loans and mortgages that remain on a bank's balance sheet. And they are, in Europe, a very large established part of the financial landscape. They are relatively unknown in the U.S. They are highly regulated. And unlike securitization, which we know has problems in the way that we've implemented it in the U.S., because the underlying loan stays on the bank's balance sheet, there's little risk that the originator of that loan will ignore prudent standards, because at the end of the day, they are stuck with that obligation if it turns out to be a dog. By pooling together lots of smaller loans into a covered bond security, the new bond creates the sufficient size and liquidity to get the interest from the large pools of capital that are out there in the world. And that is one of the mechanisms that Europe uses very successfully to draw these pools of capital into their infrastructure finance. It's a mainstay in Europe, I would even say. It's increased the availability of funds dedicated to public infrastructure. It's also a mainstay for the pension funds and the central banks and the sovereign wealth funds that I referred to earlier, which have hundreds of billions invested in these securities, just not in the United States. So even more ironically, we have the situation where we have European banks lending to U.S. infrastructure projects because they are allowed to include some of those in their pools to issue these bonds. And we're seeing that the flagship public-private partnership transactions that have happened in the U.S., you can look at the Chicago Skyway, the Indiana Toll Road, San Diego Toll Road, the Pocahontas Parkway, and you look at who lent to those transactions, and they are exclusively European banks, exclusively. It's notable.
That's really cool.
Second, because the banks in the U.S., the first part is looking at structures like a covered bond market, specifically targeted to public sector. The second, because we believe in having looked at the way that this could be catalyzed, that banks in the U.S. will be loath to bear the costs and uncertainty of creating this public sector covered bond market on their own. And we thought very hard about the creation of a new government-owned and government-capitalized infrastructure financing entity along the lines of what Laura alluded to earlier, and which we call the National Infrastructure Finance Enterprise, that would pool, sell existing and future public infrastructure securities into the capital markets and work with financial institutions in the United States. The government would own and capitalize this entity, but the knife, as we call it, would be able to fund itself through the capital markets, again, reaching into these very vast pools of capital that are out there. We envisioned something like the combination of a Fannie Mae before it was privatized and the European Investment Bank, which is Europe's development bank. It has been Europe's development bank for the past 50 years and has funded the infrastructure development in the EU and has a subscribed capital of about $255 billion. So say what you will about Europe's problems, but it's hard to disagree if you have been on one of their high-speed rail networks or driven on their roads, that you can argue with their success. And a good deal of that success has come from the creative use of market mechanisms and structures to harness the world's capital towards those projects. In fact, it's a great irony for me coming back to the U.S. that European governments, which are generally less market-friendly and more suspicious of the private sector than those in the U.S., are so much more advanced at this point than we are in the U.S. and using creative partnerships with private sector in targeting infrastructure and their use of capital markets tools to raise the vast sums that we are going to require. So the good news is that the world is really awash in capital looking for a home, and this is a perfect place for it. We need that capital to repair our crumbling infrastructure. We just need to marry those two and find mechanisms that can connect. And undoubtedly, in the proposals that we're making, there'll be those who disapprove of private sector involvement in the use of market-based tools to provide fundamental support for public infrastructure. And on the other end of the political spectrum, I'm sure that those who believe that there should be a limited role in government may also object, thinking that the markets should be left to their own devices. But I'm convinced that the huge infrastructure problems that are facing the nation demand very innovative solutions and financial solutions, that the federal government can play a key role in encouraging public-private partnerships and enabling the world's capital to flow where it is most needed. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Tom.
Okay, thank you. I think there are a lot of interesting political and economic angles on the current economic outlook and proposals for infrastructure. The specific topic that I want to talk about in my brief time here is to make the point that I think that the traditional arguments that Laura was making against fiscal policy and against infrastructure spending in particular don't apply in this current economic situation. If you think about it, the traditional arguments are that fiscal policy in general, the lags are too long. By the time you recognize you need to do something, by the time Congress passes it, by the time it takes effect, the recession's usually over. In fact, a good indicator that the recession's over is when Congress finally gets around to passing a stimulus plan. And that's even more so for infrastructure spending because of the longer lead times involved. But that view is based on the traditional post-World War II recession, which is pretty much as inflation rose, the Federal Reserve increased interest rates in order to fight inflation. That ultimately killed the interest-sensitive sectors in the economy, housing and autos. That, in turn, reined the economy in, pulled inflation down so that the Fed could start cutting interest rates. So you had relatively short recessions, roughly 2 quarters, 6 months long. And that defined the time period to evaluate fiscal stimulus against. Does that describe the current economic outlook? I don't think it does. It's interesting. I think when you look at what's going on in the financial markets now, the markets think it does. The markets are anticipating that the economy improves enough such that by the end of the year, the Federal Reserve starts raising interest rates. A year from now, they'll be about a percentage point higher than they are now. So the markets would say we don't even need another recovery plan. But I think that the reason that I think that's wrong also highlights the reasons why I think infrastructure spending plays a role in responding to this economic situation. Rather than seeing this as a typical post-World War II recession, instead it looks a lot more like the last recession, the 2001 recession, which you could call an asset-driven recession, the collapse of the NASDAQ, and then the related collapse in business spending. You could call it a balance sheet recession. You could call it just the boom-bust cycle in credit. And I think that's the more relevant perspective. In fact, I think the whole debate about whether or not we're in a recession is really a misleading one, or it's not a helpful one. It implies, as Bob Kerrey said, it's kind of a binary debate. There's no recession that's good. There's a recession that's bad. Our view at our firm, because we're an economic forecasting firm, I don't develop the forecast, but I'll defend it, is no recession, no recovery outlook. It's what the Wall Street Journal described as it's purgatory. It's not heaven, it's not hell, but there's some punishment implied for past excesses that's a part of that. And I think in that context, there is scope for a smart use of infrastructure spending. If you have I have a handout here that just has a few charts, and I'm going to go through the first page. If you have that, doesn't seem that. Maybe most people don't. Anyway, I think it's over there. But what I look at are the 3 channels through which the housing bust is influencing real GDP growth. The first is the direct impact of residential investment on GDP. I compared this actually to tech spending because similar bubbles at work, and This is, you can just see that the residential investment as a percent of GDP is falling like a rock. It probably, however, is going to bottom sometime probably by the fourth quarter. By itself, the collapse in housing investment isn't enough to justify a different approach to fiscal policy or to infrastructure. You look at the second channel, this is another one that Laura talked about, which is the credit contraction that's induced by the collapse in home prices. This is just one way to measure it. It's the tightening of bank lending standards. You can see that it's already as high as it was in the 2001 recession, which I think is very interesting because in that recession, banks didn't have a hit to their balance sheets the way they have now. I think this is likely to get tighter. I think as long as the main thing that's driving banks' balance sheets down now is the fall in home prices. If you look at something like the Case-Shiller index, it's still falling at an accelerating rate.
Right.
So I think this is likely. I think banks and credit markets more broadly are likely to remain tight for an extended period of time. For a very extended period of time. The third one then is the wealth effect. That is, as in the chart here shows how much households really got to how much they were spending beyond their means over the last several years. This effect really hasn't even started yet. And we're not likely to see it in the data for a while because of the rebate checks that went out. We're likely to keep consumer spending high for a little while. This is the one that I think really imply, the drag from housing may be fairly short term, maybe over by the end of the year. The credit contraction is likely to be an extended one, but I think the wealth effect is likely to extend even longer. So what that does is I think it creates scope for infrastructure spending really from 2 points of view. One is that you've got long-term, not a short-term drag on the economy caused. You can have public spending offsetting the contraction in private spending, and in a way that doesn't depend on the financial markets or the banking system, which is delevering. There's an economist who toiled in relative obscurity through most of his career, who's now very popular in financial markets. Hyman Minsky is his name, and his key insight is how in financial markets that stability can be destabilizing. That as people see a stable environment, they start to take on more risks. They experiment with liability structures, things like interest-only loans, like option arms, that ultimately are destabilizing. And I think people in the policy world would do well to read what he's recommending, because his solution then is that as the private sector is deleveraging, it makes sense for the public sector to lever up. So that's my contribution here, is that I think there's some interesting points to be made on the political side as well. But I think that infrastructure spending plays a role in a long-term response to the long-term outlook for the U.S. economy.
Having known Hyman Minsky, I'm sure he's smiling from wherever he is, and we have a sense of where he is. So thank you for that. I think you're right. I commend Minsky's work to all of you. Larry.
Thank you. And I agree with everything that Tom just said. I'm the president of a Washington-based policy think tank, and we've been involved in this issue as far back as last September, when we contacted our friends on Capitol Hill to say you need to start working on a stimulus plan after where it was employment declines last August. And we helped spur some of the debate and primarily work with Democrats, because they're the ones who call us, and get them ready for the debate. And I'm actually quite disappointed with the outcome. And I want to use this as an opportunity to, I have great respect for Laura. We respect each other. We don't have to go through all that. But I'll try to compare and contrast what I see as the conceptual flaws in the sort of mainstream or conventional wisdom view that led to sort of a misreading in teaching the public about what leads us to shared prosperity, what leads us to the most effective stimulus plan, and really as part of that, militates against the use of public spending and infrastructure as a mechanism for economic recovery. So let me just go through all that. One is on the basic economics and mirroring what Tom said. Economists way too much think about GDP instead of thinking about people. The issue of whether we're in a recession or not, when we have 6 months of 0.6% GDP growth, we've had 5 months of erosion of private sector jobs. You need to have 2.5% GDP growth just in order to keep unemployment from rising. You need to create around 130,000 jobs a month just to absorb new members of the workforce to keep unemployment from rising. So to me, it's about keeping your eye on the ball is jobs and unemployment, because the problem with a recession is unemployment rises, hours are cut, wages grow more slowly, and incomes are hurt.
You look at the second channel, this is another one that Laura talked about, which is the credit contraction that's induced by the collapse in home prices. This is just one way to measure it. It's the tightening of bank lending standards. You can see that it's already as high as it was in the 2001 recession, which I think is very interesting because in that recession, banks didn't have a hit to their balance sheets the way they have now. I think this is likely to get tighter. I think as long as the main thing that's driving banks' balance sheets down now is the fall in home prices. If you look at something like the Case-Shiller index, it's still falling at an accelerating rate.
Right.
So I think this is likely. I think banks and credit markets more broadly are likely to remain tight for an extended period of time. For a very extended period of time. The third one then is the wealth effect. That is, as in the chart here shows how much households really got to how much they were spending beyond their means over the last several years. This effect really hasn't even started yet. And we're not likely to see it in the data for a while because of the rebate checks that went out. We're likely to keep consumer spending high for a little while. This is the one that I think really imply, the drag from housing may be fairly short term, maybe over by the end of the year. The credit contraction is likely to be an extended one, but I think the wealth effect is likely to extend even longer. So what that does is I think it creates scope for infrastructure spending really from 2 points of view. One is that you've got long-term, not a short-term drag on the economy caused. You can have public spending offsetting the contraction in private spending, and in a way that doesn't depend on the financial markets or the banking system, which is delevering. There's an economist who toiled in relative obscurity through most of his career, who is now very popular in financial markets. Hyman Minsky is his name, and his key insight is how in financial markets that stability can be destabilizing. That as people see a stable environment, they start to take on more risks. They experiment with liability structures, things like interest-only loans, like option arms, that ultimately are destabilizing. And I think people in the policy world would do well to read what he's recommending, because his solution then is that as the private sector is deleveraging, it makes sense for the public sector to lever up. So that's my contribution here, is that I think there's some interesting points to be made on the political side as well. But I think that infrastructure spending plays a role in a long-term response to the long-term outlook for the U.S. economy.
Having known Hyman Minsky, I'm sure he's smiling from wherever he is, and we have a sense of where he is. So thank you for that. I think you're right. I commend Minsky's work to all of you. Larry.
Thank you. And I agree with everything that Tom just said. I'm the president of a Washington-based policy think tank, and we've been involved in this issue as far back as last September, when we contacted our friends on Capitol Hill to say you need to start working on a stimulus plan after where it was employment declines last August. And we helped spur some of the debate and primarily work with Democrats, because they're the ones who call us, and get them ready for the debate. And I'm actually quite disappointed with the outcome. And I want to use this as an opportunity to, I have great respect for Laura. We respect each other. We don't have to go through all that. But I'll try to compare and contrast what I see as the conceptual flaws in the sort of mainstream or conventional wisdom view that led to sort of a misreading in teaching the public about what leads us to shared prosperity, what leads us to the most effective stimulus plan, and really as part of that, militates against the use of public spending and infrastructure as a mechanism for economic recovery. So let me just go through all that. One is on the basic economics and mirroring what Tom said. Economists way too much think about GDP instead of thinking about people. The issue of whether we're in a recession or not, when we have 6 months of 0.6% GDP growth, we've had 5 months of erosion of private sector jobs. You need to have 2.5% GDP growth just in order to keep unemployment from rising. You need to create around 130,000 jobs a month just to absorb new members of the workforce to keep unemployment from rising. So to me, it's about keeping your eye on the ball is jobs and unemployment, because the problem with a recession is unemployment rises, hours are cut, wages grow more slowly, and incomes are hurt. Really very much across the board, but even more so for disadvantaged populations. So the issue is unemployment primarily. And right now, and before we get into the stimulus debate, the projections were for steadily rising unemployment through 2008 and into 2009. Mm-hmm. This is why I think the notion of timeliness that Laura and I'd say, which was sort of implicit in the debate, was almost as if we have to do something that's going to stop us from going into a recession rather than ameliorating the rise of unemployment. Right. And the character of recessions in the last two have been, who cares about GDP, but we had, years of joblessness and job losses, and that's what you would keep your eye on. Okay, so let me go through sort of almost in chronological order the flaws in the way I think my team approached this matter. The first was President Bush went in a 2-week period from the economy is fundamentally sound to we need a stimulus. When he did that, which I think was a great thing, and one should be ready to come to the table to meet with him, here's what no one did. No one said, that's great, you have now become a Keynesian.
Yeah.
You have now agreed that the government has a responsibility to managing the business cycle. This is a huge ideological concession that no one ever forced on him, because I think our team doesn't like to deal in ideology, although the other team does. Okay, this is a huge concession. This was not about supply-side tax cuts, making people more motivated to work and invest. This was about putting money in people's pockets. That's our side's story, not his. Okay, second, to get him to the table, right off the top, it was said he can have $50 billion for business, tax cuts, bonus depreciation, which almost all the economists, center right to left, would say is almost totally wasted.
That's right.
But why? Well, I mean, part of it is, I think, in secret. A lot of the leading Democrats might think they like to give something to business and get credit for it. And otherwise, it was just bad policy. And when you think about what $50 billion is needed for in our economy, in our populations, it's absolutely criminal, in my view. Third, there's a real bias against spending and towards private consumption. That's implicit in this debate. Everything in that package was about tax cuts for somebody, business or individuals. In fact, there's nothing in Keynesian thinking that says anything about tax cuts. It says about lowering revenues, payments to individuals. And I think it's partly, we made the same mistake in talking about tax rebates. We put it in the tax mode. So Bush was able to say, and the Republicans were able to say, what they were doing is all about tax cuts. It fit into the same frame as supply side measures. So we allowed them the simplicity of their message, which is tax cuts are always good, no matter what stage of the business cycle. Mm-hmm. And it's a little bit contrast to what Laura was saying about the problems in '93, which I agree. But we essentially allowed them their simple story. And I even saw ads run by progressive groups for congressmen, Democrats bragging about their giving tax cuts to people, which is, to me, the wrong theme. The other, another way that we bias the discussion towards individual payments, which is part of a package I favored. I mean, you do it because I think as a balanced package for stimulus, you would want something that goes to individuals to get money into the hands of people to spend quickly, but you could have much more balance. There's an implicit comparison like that Laura did with infrastructure spending. You only spend 25-30% of it over a year, and implied is that the money given to individuals is all spent during the year. But the actual estimates from earlier this decade was that somewhere between 30 to 60% of the individual payments given to people would be spent. We know that 10% of that at least is going to go to imports. Yet we know infrastructure spending, even if only half of it got spent in the year, and very little that goes to imports, is clearly as effective as individual payments. So there's sort of an unknowingness associated with payments to individuals that I think is really mistaken. Let me just sort of mention what I think is the case for infrastructure spending as part of a package that should have been legislated already in the first round. One, people don't really understand why the payments to individuals is about stimulating the economy and lowering unemployment. Everybody gets public works, really. I mean, it's Democrats are afraid of being accused of being tax and spenders or spenders. But in fact, the population give money, build stuff in my neighborhood, my city. It creates jobs. Those people spend money. That creates more jobs. It's visible and understandable. It's a twofer. You get not only an injection of spending and jobs, you get a long-term productivity effect as well. Laura sort of mentioned that. You get short-run demand boost, and you get a long-run productivity effect. I think there were legitimate concerns about how quickly the spending could be. We recommended that we do infrastructure repairs, not new projects. So a lot of the issues that Laura raised don't apply to that. And we know from calling lots of heads of Department of Transportation that there are backlogs of repairs, things that are already approved. It's a shortage of money. And New York's proved it. We said not only roads and bridges, but school repairs. There was a giant settlement, as everyone knows, for equity and adequacy for schools in New York. A lot of money showed up. And I think billions of dollars spent on school repairs within like a summer and a year. Yeah. Sort of a windfall amount of money. It really can be done. And there is a list of already approved projects that were just short of money. We calculated that you could have spent $6 billion on bridge repairs. Of those 25% that are just ready to fall down, which would have created 75,000 jobs. And let me contrast that to the actual stimulus plan is over $150 billion, and the administration is only claiming to be able to create 500,000 jobs. That's $300,000 per job, compared to what I'm talking about was around $80,000 per job. We could have done as much as the $500,000 with lots of other things quicker. And in terms of the timeliness of it, so if we actually got only half of that infrastructure spending done in 2008, it would have been as effective or more effective, given that there's very little imports in infrastructure, as the individual payments. And at worst, some of the money would have been spent in early 2009, when we know, as of right now, the projections are for close to 6.5% unemployment by the end of 2009. So I think that I agreed, and we articulated a version of temporary, targeted, and timely as well. Part of that, the temporary, is also about not having permanent tax cuts as part of the measure. That's really what's really important. You don't want to do something that builds in a long-term budget deficit. You didn't say that.
Yeah, exactly.
Luckily, we didn't get that.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. I think it's really important. And I think it is true that if you do infrastructure, that it can be a one-time thing. Okay, the last... let me just comment on the politics. It's hard to sit in someone else's, in my seat, and make judgments about what politicians do. But let me just say that in January, I think there was too much pressure felt from our side to do something right away, because it didn't have to happen right away. Here you have a Republican president with horrible ratings, about his judgment on how to pursue economic policy, facing a November election where it looks like his team in Congress is going to get trounced. And the business community in Wall Street telling him that they're scared to looking into a dark abyss. They don't actually say it always out loud in the Wall Street Journal, but when you talk to them, you feel like you're looking at people looking into a dark abyss. So this is who you're negotiating with. I feel like we could have done better to have a much better orientation of the payments to individuals, be much more inclusive than what we got in the House. We definitely should have had extended unemployment insurance. I think we could have had these things that Laura and I are in agreement about what goes into a package. I'm a little less forgiving about what wasn't in the first package versus something that comes later. especially given that the politics are that this president vetoes everything that Democrats are trying to do. And here you had something which was sure to go through. So if you didn't get it, really all this other stuff we're talking about, Democrats may vote on, they may get some Republican votes, they may pass it, but it's not going to get through the White House. So to say something can be done in a second tranche of stimulus is basically to say it's not going to get done. Thank you.
Wow.
Can I ask Larry a question?
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Larry, because it just follows. It'll open up the discussion. The politics are, you talked about the president. The problem for the House was they were lucky they could get the Senate to go along with even what they had. That is, this was a problem that the Senate took out everything that had to do with the kinds of things we think should be done. So I think the problem for if you're right and the Democrats threw away something that they could have had, I'm surprised because I think the view was that they barely squeaked by because of the problem of the 60 votes in the Senate. And the key thing for the future is getting 60 votes in the Senate. The big challenge for the Democrats is actually being able not to get not just the White House but the Senate, because the Senate holds this stuff up.
May I just?
So I want to know what the politics are. This is
I think what's really interesting about the politics here, because I think what you're talking about is generally the situation with most legislation. But it's really interesting that this is the only thing I can remember in many years where I thought the Senate moved something that came out of the House more progressive.
Okay. Right.
You know, and looking at what happened to the individual payments, they put in money to vets and to older people. They moved it to be more tax refundable. They did all these things that actually made the distributional. And this is clearly a case where the economics and equity march hand in hand, right? We believe that giving money to people that have less money those are people that are more likely to spend it, therefore it'll be more effective. So being good to your friends is good economics, tightly wrapped in this instance. And the Senate did better, and I don't know, I have no reason to believe that they would not. I know that they would have gone for extended unemployment benefits in there. And I don't want to get into a judgment about people want to action.
About your politics, about whether there really was the opportunity for the Democrats to do more. And then I don't know why they didn't. But that's so. Why don't we just?
Tom being an economist.
And this debate about the stimulus may actually reflect why we don't have just a spirited debate about a national investment bank or a European investment bank. So I don't want to lose the middle of the panel's discussion because it is all of a piece. We have government here trying to help the economy, maybe temporarily, but there's this gaping, gap between the quality of life of Europeans and here, and it might be centered on the way we actually do the mundane financing of investment and appropriate this investment. So, Tom and Heidi, before we go to the audience, is that all right? Okay.
Yep. I just wanted. I was surprised. I thought that the Congress would follow kind of Larry's suggestion here and be more confrontational in it. I mean, this looked to me so much like 1992. I mean, really, that was the only recession in modern times where there was no fiscal stimulus. And I'm thinking, look at the comparison. We just had a war with Iraq. You had an unpopular president named Bush fighting a Democratic Congress. You had a Clinton making a comeback in New Hampshire. I mean, it just looked like you were going to get another stalemate, or at least an attempt at confrontation. And I think it's because Democrats didn't want to be seen as obstructing. And the broader point in all this is the unemployment rate was like 4.7%. The fear of standing in the way of this, I mean, the responsiveness to the economy, anticipating economic problems was really amazing.
And Heidi, do you want to wait for the response, or do you have something to say here?
Well, since the discussion's been on macroeconomy, and I'm the only non-economist,
okay, we'll wait
till it opens.
Stop bragging.
Right, you don't brag.
When does that stop anybody?
Since this is a university, I just want to tell the audience that I will give privilege to students who want to speak. So if it looks like I'm playing favorites, I am. So first of all, I'd like to open it up to any students in the room that might want to ask the first question. Anybody here? Yes, Mishel, one of our co-authors of our paper in the booklet.
It's a great.
Should I stand here?
Yeah. So
okay. Here's a question I wanted to ask. I mean, I think we're all convinced that the fiscal stimulus package was misplaced in terms of, giving money to people who may or may not spend it. But in the first instance, how would you get the American people to sort of agree not to receive, a rebate from the government and instead direct that money to infrastructure spending? That's one thing. The other thing is that I think in order to actually get the government on board with spending more on infrastructure, you have to get the American people on board. And aside from anecdotal incidents where a bridge collapses or the levees fail in New Orleans, I think, most American people probably don't feel like infrastructure is, really, really deteriorating in this country as opposed to, in third world countries. So I guess the broad stroke of my question is, how do you get the American people to buy into the government needs to spend more on infrastructure spending so that they therefore pressure their representatives to do so?
I'll suggest a couple things. Number one, I do think that people do understand at the state and local level, because if you can just take it in terms of the safety of their school buildings, which is a very simple one. And I do think one of the things that was disturbing about the stimulus debate was there really was a lot of resistance in the Congress to having a significant component of this be aid to state and local governments. We need to remember that really right now in the U.S. and for the foreseeable future, the lion's share of infrastructure spending is done by state and local governments. So we would be better off sort of helping them do it, and then it's much closer to the individual because it's their road, it's their highway congestion, it's their school building. The second thing is, longer term, I really think, given the price of energy and given any reasonable outlook for the price of energy, you can tie a lot of infrastructure spending and projects to the need for energy independence, or the need, at the very least, to reduce U.S. dependence on foreign energy, and tie it also for those who are environmentally inclined to climate change. And so it becomes a kind of, somebody said, 2 for, 3 for, 4 for. There are lots of ways in which you can say to people, if we invest in these kinds of infrastructure projects, that will actually reduce our dependence on foreign energy. So those would be my answers.
Yeah, Tom.
I just tossed in a thought on your suggestion that voters want the rebates. I think the fact that the gas tax holiday didn't work so well for Senator Clinton argues that voters aren't as short-sighted or focused on the self-interest as you might think. And I actually think a lot of people know that infrastructure does need spending, and that's where I think some of Heidi's ideas about ways to set up these separate financing,
right,
so that you have the financing tied to the projects as opposed to kind of being part of the broader budget, actually can be a way to funnel or be a way to generate public support.
I just think one of the oh, go on, Heidi.
Oh, it's okay. Just there have been some studies on polling people on if you had dedicated taxes or specific tolls tied to specific infrastructure projects. There's generally high support for it locally because more general taxation, or when there's no direct tie to something that's going to be a local improvement. It's just that you don't get enough support. But in the polls that I've seen, there's generally widespread, significant support from the public when you do have it tied specifically to a local infrastructure project.
Heidi, in that polling, is there any preference for schools over bridges or roads?
The ones that I've seen have been mostly tied to the repair of certain bridges. I'm sure that there are studies out there, but the ones that I've seen have been tied to bridge repair primarily.
Okay.
Just a comment. One of the problems I find in a dialogue with the public about these questions is that they rightly see that we have a broken economy, and they don't automatically think in the terms that we economists think of as there's a cyclical problem and a long-term structural problem, and here's my solution for the cyclical problem. Here's my they just sort of say it's broken, yada yada. I do think in terms of a short-term stimulus Keynesian plan to get some money to individuals to spend is not a wrong thing to do. I think we're just unbalanced to rely solely on that, and I think it just militates bad politics and bad message, etc. If you told people we're giving you money, it doesn't solve the economic problem, but we need you to go out and spend. This is our way to kind of have unemployment not rise as much as it otherwise would. I think people would get it more. Plus, they should see people building things in their community.
I could just say one bridge to nowhere, though, and you're done.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's,
one bad bridge and you're done.
yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I guess would like to pretty much echo what Larry had said, but from a different perspective. Thanks.
Here at the microphone, that's all.
I would like to echo what you said, but from a different perspective. Thanks to the AMT and other things, I pay an eye-popping amount in tax. And so in all of this, you have to have support of the people who pay the tax. One of the reasons why the Bush people have been so successful with the no new taxes is because all the high-income people think it's in their best interest. And this stimulus, to me, just smacks of a cheesy vote-buying gimmick. And me as a high-income person who is the one who pays for this, I question, one, who is the end beneficiary? And two is, what do I get? And to me, the end beneficiary of this and the intended end beneficiary are people like Walmart and Starbucks. Gee whiz, we don't want their profits to fail. Well, you know what? My tax dollars don't need to subsidize Walmart. They just don't. Number one. Number two is, at the end of the day, if this is the right thing for me to do, what do I get? Well, if this money were spent on infrastructure, well, long term, I and my children would be better off. But long term, the Walmart executives are going to get their bonus. And to me, I think it's a ripoff of the American taxpayer. So if the Democrats wonder why Wall Street and high-income people vote Republican, well, this is a good example.
Do you mind if I take a couple more comments and then comments from the
That's
panel?
good.
Yes, sir.
Within the policy community, there's a unexpressed. I'm sorry. Yeah.
If you make it,
Thank you.
Can
Yes.
I make it short?
Yeah, just very quickly, within the policy community, which this dais is clearly card-carrying members, there's an unexpressed precept, and that is that we've given up a fight on inflation. There's no national sentiment to reduce the war spending. There's no national sentiment to raise interest rates. There's national sentiment only to kick the ball into another 5-year, 10-year, 15-year. Can you comment on this? This is a very scary proposition, I suggest.
Yeah. Let have two more comments, but that is a good point. Anybody? Yes, a student.
You wait for. My question is to Tom. I'm looking at one of his graphs to do with the spending and income. I mean, the fact that spending has been exceeding income since '95, and it's been persistently exceeding income by, and now up to a difference of about 4%. How sustainable is that? I mean, you have spending way above for a long period of time, and it seems like a structural break. I mean, if you look at the graph going back to 1950, you never get a period where it's above and for such a long period. And they have to diverge. So isn't that part of the problem?
No, the savings is a structural break. One more, and then we'll go to the panel. Yes, sir.
I'd like to comment on something which I think is not getting enough attention. Mainly the drain on the consumers. There's talk about giving money to consumers. The way
David.
Hold up the mic.
David, David. Thank you, David.
Sorry, could you start over for the
yeah. There has been practically no emphasis on what has been actually draining money from people, and there's talk about how to get money back into the pockets of people. I have heard nobody here really addressing the issue of how do you stop the drain of our wealth going over to the Middle East in the way of whatever. Nobody has talked about the huge, humongous salaries executives have been taking, which in turn has come from cutting back on pension plans and group insurance, all of which has been taking money away from people, and also the low salaries which have been paid. Nobody has really addressed this, and you're talking about an indirect way of getting money back in, and not addressing the direct way money has been taken away from consumers.
Okay. But if you want to respond to inflation, savings, and inequality of income, just briefly.
Well, inflation, let me say that so far there is some good news here. The good news is that one of the things that the Fed and other economists look at, and maybe it's deteriorated, Tom would know this better than I, but so far we don't see a change in inflationary expectations. So basically what we have is we have a situation where we have sharply accelerating food and energy prices, headline inflation rates significantly higher. But people so far seem to be looking through that is, people who make these inflationary expectation judgments in financial markets, and saying that we have not encountered a sustained long-run increase in inflation. Now, that's all I would say. This is something we have to continue to watch, because what we didn't talk enough about here today probably is the extent of, you take a very weak economy and we're now putting on top of it an unanticipated severe oil shock. I mean, you don't have 30% increase in the price of oil in half a year to basically not have an effect on the economy and not having it. So I do worry a lot about that. On the composition of distribution of income, I would say I want to distinguish that from the macroeconomy. We've had some very serious deterioration from my perspective in the distribution of income in the United States. We've had this is not a short-term problem. It didn't happen over the last year. It's happened over many years. We see dramatic increases only in the top 1% of the income distribution, the people who are paying significant taxes but are taking huge increases in income where everybody else is taking virtually none. And I think that is not a problem of aggregate demand. That's a problem of what you do with compensation policy and tax policy and social welfare policy, a huge set of policies to deal with the distribution of income.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Starbucks or Bridges?
Let me talk about inflation and the sustainability of household spending. On inflation, I think Laura's right. I think the Fed did the appropriate thing to put growth risks ahead of inflation risks. It's true you've got higher headline inflation, but you're not seeing the second order effects, which you look for in inflation expectations. As Laura was mentioning, they are creeping up, but they're still kind of within an acceptable range. You don't see it in wages, which is the really big difference between now and the 70s. I mean, I was alive and cognizant when the term stagflation was coined. That was where you factored in 5, 7, 10% inflation expectations into every decision: wages, prices, borrowing. That's not what's happening now, especially in the labor market. And then the last area you look for is in core inflation, and you're not seeing it there. So for now, I think that's appropriate. So why are food and fuel prices rising? I don't know if everybody has this sheet, but on page 5 at the bottom, I have a table that basically says, in this case, I don't think it's the Fed. I think it's mainly emerging market central banks that are responsible for this. This just it's a simple metric to compare monetary policy, looking at the real policy rate versus the real growth rate. G7 countries have moderately stimulative policies. The BRICS, other than Brazil, have very stimulative. And then I just threw in the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, where they're just blowing the doors out. Yeah, that's a gusher, if you will. So I actually think that unless you get a U.S. slowdown that spreads abroad, we probably will have a fairly serious commodity price inflation continuing, because these central banks aren't really responding in a way that you would like them to. Then briefly on the question on the sustainability of household spending, that's the third chart on page 1. I guess that was the point I was trying to make, is that it's not sustainable. That for decades the household sector was a net saver. They became a net borrower, and the counterpart to that was basically the current account deficit. They were borrowing basically from abroad. That started to correct. So it's because of the long-term outlook for weakness, not necessarily decline, but at least weakness in consumption and residential investment, that is the argument for offsetting that weakness with public investment.
To see. And I guess the last thing I want to say is I'd like acknowledgement that as an economist I didn't bring PowerPoint or one graph.
Yay!
Not to criticize you, you did great. But I guess I did that without a safety net.
Just to follow up on the question of public support, I think what we need to do a very good job of is painting a picture of what the future would look like if we could cut our commuting times down by 50 to 75% with a high-speed train. What not only just from quality of life, but from safety, what it will actually mean if we put the money for both ourselves and our children into making it a reality. The picture needs to be painted better. And the second point, the central banks that you mentioned that have all those reserves, that are funded by our trade imbalances and funded by the price of oil that we're sending to GCC countries to fund their central bank reserves. Let me paint a picture for you of wouldn't it be nice to use those productively to draw them back into U.S. infrastructure as opposed to seeing them go somewhere else. And the reason that I'm saying that is because both of those pictures are a reality right now in Europe. The cutting down on commuting times, even in third world countries, not just Europe, if you travel, you just are amazed by how far advanced a lot of these places have really come in a very short amount of time. And the second is that those central bank reserves are being channeled to infrastructure in many, many places in the world, just not here. We have to ask why.
Right. That's sad.
In the back, Johan, I'll wait carefully for the microphone. Very good.
The question I had is, you really need to perhaps redefine what we call infrastructure, because we're in the 21st century. We may need to think more about how do we get better satellite links for data distribution, how do we link up rural communities, how do we begin to transfer health information over networks, how do we build optical networks that really make us not 12th, 15th, or 17th in the world in terms of connectivity to the internet, but number one.
Is it that bad? It's that bad?
Yeah, and the statistics just got updated yesterday. They're available from the OECD.
Oh, okay. A couple more. Professor Nell, my colleague.
First, the main issue on infrastructure is not altogether new. Remember John Kenneth Galbraith's 1957 book, The Affluent Society, which pointed out that in the United States you had private wealth but public squalor. And I think that is underlined by the fact that in the last 50 years, we have seen the manufacturing sector go from 25 or 26% of the U.S. economy down to about 14 or 15. We have lost the good jobs and the high-paying jobs. But the rebuilding of infrastructure will be not only manufacturing and construction, but also high-tech. And this could provide a long-term, that is, a 50-year perspective to build a new replacement for the manufacturing that we have lost.
Well, the last word will go to our panelists. So would you like to comment? Oh, one more? Sorry? Okay,
there are a couple
you
more.
have the microphone and you
Thanks.
have the time.
It's okay.
Thank you for your patience. I was very interested in some of the comments that Heidi had mentioned about new financing ideas in Europe's, I guess, experiment or on bond financing. But if a national bond market cannot materialize, like the financing, many of the ideas from Europe cannot materialize for political reasons in the United States, and this is for the panel and for anybody who can answer in the panel, how would you propose funding capital infrastructure projects when investor sentiment is low?
Yeah, sure.
Just one comment on the ideas that we put forth in this paper are just, they sort of jumped out as obvious potential solutions. So we're very open to looking at other mechanisms that might work as well. But these just jumped out as obvious solutions. If the willing investor base for these types of bonds is immense, and in all of my conversations with market participants about this idea, they basically said it would be almost bottomless with the huge growth in assets outside of the U.S. looking for a safe public sector type investments. So I would just say that if we can come up, it might not be these mechanisms, but if we can come up with ways to tap into that, it's a very, very big pool of willing investors that that look at this as a way to protect their assets at the highest grade of security that would be out there. So that whether it's these mechanisms or other ones, that is a very willing and growing pool to tap into.
Laura? So I think we should end with some optimism here, not so much about the near-term prospects for the economy, but about the possible shift in thinking in America on the role of government going forward. It's the case, and I think Tom mentioned it, I think the next several years we've got to shift our demand from the sources of our engines of growth from sort of personal consumption and residential consumption to really net exports and I would say infrastructure investment. And net exports we're going to get because the lower value of the dollar is going to help us here, and that will shift some of the spending back towards the United States. But I think we really can use this as an opportunity to mobilize support for infrastructure spending. And I think some of the ideas that really are now already working through the Congress, Rosa DeLaura's bill, the bill on the National Infrastructure Bank, tied with ideas like the ideas that are coming out of Heidi and the New American Foundation, we can really do something to change the financing outlook for this kind of investment. So I would put that's why I said, think about the priorities of the next administration with enough votes in the Senate to actually move forward some progressive legislation on infrastructure spending, on the environment, and on health. We really have an opportunity right now to redefine the way the U.S. moves forward in the next decade. So I want to end on some optimism that's politically based.
Yes.
If Larry would agree, he's sitting much closer than I am to Washington at this point. So
We'll see. We'll see. Thank you very much for your time.